Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few things. I think one of the interesting things here is, I mean, it's amazing how his whole win, especially the last few minutes where we just went to making crap up. But it's an interesting process here. And one of the problems goes back, though, to before you got there. And this is the problem that this committee saw in the previous Attorney General and the previous FBI Director and the previous, previous two Attorney Generals, to be honest, in this, in which things were done out of order, out of sequence, meeting with former president on the tarmac, not disclosing it. These are the things that have just led to some distrust as we go forward. I just have a few questions, specific questions, and these can be, without commenting on an ongoing investigation at all of any kind, is there, in your opinion, a constitutional standard that guides your department in investigating any president, a president or any president? Ms. Rosenstein.
Is there a constitutional standard?
Yeah, do you think there is or is not?
I'm not aware of any provision in the Constitution that addresses that.
Okay. Is there an Office of Legal Counsel opinion that informs the department in this area? And if so, are you directing Special Counsel Miller to follow it?
You're referring to the issue of whether a president can be indicted?
And well, not just in the sense of how these investigations are to be handled. I think that's been a lot of this conversation that we've had around.
I know that there are two historical opinions, but I have not read them.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't read them recently. I probably have seen them at some point, but I'm not in position to comment on the details of them, and I don't recall whether it's a constitutional issue or not.
Well, I think it does goes to the indictment as well. I mean, it does go to that issue as well. Has there been any discussion about that? Is there a possibility of indictment or non-indictment of that, of the president?
I have not, Congressman, commented on anything about who may or may not be indicted. All that speculation that you read, sir, has nothing to do with me. And
that's fine, and that's why you're on record here and answering the question, and I appreciate that, and with you both. Let's go back to something, though, that I asked you, that you and I had a conversation about a few months ago, and this was Mr. Strzok's issue. I asked you at the time, did he have his security clearance? You said that you would check. You would assume he did at that point. It now appears that security clearance has been revoked. The concern I have here is, again, process inside the Department of Justice on what happens when you have someone of his caliber, counterintelligence level. This is not a new recruit. This is somebody who's been around, who's had very sensitive information. And on January 13th, 2016, an individual from the FBI's Washington field office emailed Mr. Strzok and other employees that their polygraphs were out of, I think that was out of scope. I asked you about that and asked you if he had been polygraphed. You didn't know at the time. It said the polygraph raised flags. Now, my question about this would be, you didn't know about the polygraph at the time. We'll just assume now that it is out there you do. Would the topic of the extramarital affair have come up in that polygraph, or a possibility come up in that polygraph on Mr. Strzok that could have put it out of scope?
I do not know the answer.
Either way.
I have no idea what would have been raised in any specific person's polygraph at this moment.
Could he have passed a polygraph, given the text, and I'm putting this in context of the text that we see now before continuing in very sensitive areas such as the investigation, the Mueller investigation, again, the Hillary Clinton, but knowing the bias that we have seen, that we've commented on today, if those texts taken into account were on this polygraph, and could he have passed a polygraph if he, on his own ability, denying an affair with Lisa Page?
Well, Congressman, I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals, especially hypotheticals when, as I've said before, we have referred a number of individuals mentioned prominently in the report to our Office of Professional Responsibility for the appropriate disciplinary process, and my commitment to doing things by the book includes not, as FBI Director, commenting on them while they're ongoing.
Okay, let's go back to process and personnel here. If they're out of scope, do you think it's interesting that you would continue to have someone in an investigation of such magnitude and sensitivity who've basically had a failed polygraph or an out-of-scope polygraph test in which they had to then go back and re-answer or complete sensitive compartmentalized information requests on this? Would they stay in that investigation? And if so, were they treated differently because of his position or who he was?
Well, again, I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals about individuals that may have been referred for our disciplinary process.
Does it not strike you as strange, though, Mr. Wray, and I was not going here, but now you've led me here. Is it not strike you strange that someone who has had an issue with a polygraph during the investigation which you have, in which sensitive information were coming about, in which we've now seen the text and other things, what would be that? So could they just flunk a polygraph and you just keep them on? If they could flunk questions, do you keep them on sensitive information simply because that? Not particularly Mr. Strzok here. I'm talking an overall policy. Is your policy just to keep people around that lie?
Of course not.
Okay, then why would we have an issue here in which there is at least an assumption that something is not right? How did this individual continue to stay on investigations when there is polygraph evidence where he had to go back through and say it's out of sorts? And we know that from one of those, the other employees were in a relationship and later got married and disclosed that relationship. So how was this individual kept in an investigative role in this when there was a sensitivity factor here of possibly lying or even now we know bias?
Well,
The time the gentleman has expired. The director
I would
may
like
answer
to
the question.
respond. As I have said repeatedly, we are going to hold people accountable and make sure that we follow our policies strictly. And that does not include me commenting on pending matters involving those people. I want to make sure that people are held accountable, but I want to make sure it's done right and by the book, and I'm not going to do it any other way.
And I understand that, Mr. Director, but also I'll say this, and Ms. Rosenstein, you made this comment, I appreciate the comment earlier. You said this needs to finish appropriately. And my question is what, and then I'll finish with this and just say, what time is appropriately, and what does it look like?
Time of
Thank
the
you, Mr.
gentleman
Chairman.
has
Chairman, may I-
expired, but Mr. Rosenstein can answer the question.
I clarify my earlier answer, Mr. Collins. I apologize. I think I misunderstood. You were asking me about department policies. If you're referring to issues of, for example, whether you can issue a subpoena, that may be what you had in mind in terms of process. And so, if those issues arose, we would do an appropriate review as to what the facts and the law are, and we'd make an appropriate decision. And my answer was simply focused on your original question. I don't think anything in the Constitution directly addresses that, but certainly there could be constitutional issues.